There's one other thing you can do real quick, and it's really fast. You can do a leak test, okay? That's another diagnostic test that's built in. If you run your leak test and the leak runs fine, that could also help the technician if he has to come in, right? The leak test passes fine. Maybe it isn't a leak. Maybe it is something else.
Rising above the buzz of ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week, we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal: to help you fight dirty, every instrument, every time. Whether you're tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go beyond clean.
Joining us this week on Beyond Clean, Don Tumminelli, Senior Technical Manager of Client Services at High Power Validation Testing and Lab Services. Bobby, we're going to be doing some science today, talking about some really technical things in the Bowie Dick test. Are you excited about this topic?
Yeah, call me Johnny Clipboard. I've got my pencil sharpened and I've got some questions for Don. This is an interesting one. It's one that we touch every day. It's it's the daily air removal test. It's our Bowie Dick test. So something we ought to understand a little bit better, and who better to ask than Don?
Yeah, this is actually one of my favorite interview tests, either for people who are applying to work in my hospital that have worked in other hospitals before, or if they're travelers and they want to come work. I throw in a quick question on, explain to me what the Bowie Dick test actually tests, just to get a baseline understanding of, do they know? I know they got credentials, I know they got certifications, but do they actually know what it is they're doing every day? This is one of my ringer questions. So now we're going to give away all the answers on this interview. Hang with us here. We'll be right back with Don Tumminelli.
I'm Justin Poulin.
And I'm Hank Balch.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
And joining us in studio today is Don Tumminelli, the Senior Technical Manager of Client Services at High Power Validation Testing and Lab Services. And if you're familiar with the Beyond Clean podcast or our Beyond Clean conferences, you've probably seen Don around. But if you're new to the show, you're in for a treat. So this guy knows his stuff when it comes to technical sterile processing, sterilization type science. So we're going to crack open his skull. We're going to dig into his brain today, hopefully in a way that doesn't leave him reeling at the end of the interview. So Don, welcome back to the show, man.
Yeah, it's great to be back, and thanks for having me on this special podcast.
Yeah. So, the whole season here, we're talking about different consumables in sterile processing, and it wouldn't be a good season if we didn't cover this topic. But before we get into it, I kind of want your opinion on pronunciation. It's always a fun one for me being from Texas, and just everyone, chooses their words in our industry sometimes, or what they like to say and how they like to say. So this one, I call it the Bowie Dick, but I think Bobby calls it the Bowie Dick, and I'd like to know what Don Tumminelli calls it.
Oh, boy. Well, here in upstate New York, we just call it the Bowie Dick. But if you're in the lab and you want to have a chuckle for the day, some folks have been known to call it the David Bowie Dick. So,
okay. Well, I haven't heard that one before. So, we'll add that to the list of options there. So Bowie Dick it is then. I kind of want to ask, before we get into all the science and everything behind it, like, what is this test that we're talking about? We do have folks that tune in to the show that are students just kind of training in the industry. Maybe they haven't even worked a single day in sterile processing yet. And we have a lot of manufacturers and vendor reps that are not really familiar at all with the sterilization testing process. So if you were to give an introduction introductory description to this test. What exactly is it that we're talking about?
Sure. More than happy to do that for you. Yeah, so the Bowie Dick test, here's just a little history first, okay, guys, just to give you a little background. It was back in the 60s when two colleagues, Dr. J. Bowie and Mr. J. Dick, both developed this pack of Huck towels and sterilization tape, okay, chemical indicator tape, to assess the autoclave's vacuum system, okay, the ability of the sterilizer to remove air from the chamber. And just real quick, why is it important to remove air from the chamber? Well, air is an insulator, and if you have air in your chamber, it could interfere with your sterilization process and achieving sterility. So they realized it was important to have some type of diagnostic test to help assure that your pre-vacuum phase of your sterilization cycle was working properly. And they developed this with a number of towels folded together. It was about 10 to 12 inches high. And then what they did was they took sterilization tape and they just made X patterns, or some people say St. Andrew's cross, on some of the sheets in the middle, or some of the towels in the middle. And then they wrapped it with a large piece of sterilization wrap, usually that cotton of some sort or muslin. And then they put it in a sterilizer and they ran the cycle. And then when they were done with the cycle, they opened it up and they looked to see if the chemical indicator ink turned. And it's, some people might think of it as a penetration test. But basically, at the end of the day, it is according to AMI ST 79, it is a diagnostic test of your dynamic air removal steam sterilizer's ability to remove air from the chamber. Okay? So it is a diagnostic test looking for residual air in the chamber.
Yeah, before the episode today, Bobby and I were doing something morbid. We were reading the obituary of Dr. Bowie. And man, I mean, he did like crazy things, like served in India in the military. Then, of course, he came back over to the UK, was doing these tests that you were describing, kind of looked around the UK hospital and you realize these sterilizers may not be working the way that we think they're working or that they should be working. So let's maybe test them. And then I think he ended his life out in Zimbabwe doing work down there. So, you know, he was all over the place and just thinking through these complex problems in healthcare. So,
wow,
kind of cool
great
story.
I did not know that piece of the story. That's a nice little
Yeah. Look it up. You know, we may even put in the bonus content, how to think about it. We can attach a PDF to this episode. So if you check the bonus content when this comes out, we'll try to put that PDF there. It's kind of interesting. So in just the practicals, that was a great background, definition out of the AMI guidelines. But, practically speaking, what role in the everyday life of the department do these tests play? Like, when would a technician come in contact with these tests?
Okay, great question. Yeah, so once again, according to AMI ST 79, the standard requires you to challenge your sterilizer every 24-hour period. And so most facilities, I would think a high percentage in the 90s, are all doing it first thing in the morning, okay? So when you fire up your central sterile department, you would just run a quick warm-up cycle to flush any residual moisture, humidity out of the system, and then your second cycle would be your Bowie Dick test cycle. So this is before you start processing any devices or product throughout the day. So this would be first thing in the morning. So first shift, if you want to call it that.
It's important to bring up that daily piece of it. And I just want to go back and say I appreciate you bringing up some of the history of where we got this crazy name. It reminds me of a T-shirt I saw somewhere that said, Bowie Dick test, do one every day, or something like that. I just imagine what the strangers in Walmart will think of that shirt, right? But some people out there who are, working in the department and reading whatever shows up on their sterilizer, they may see the cycle referred to as a DART test, and those two things are interchanged with one another. Do you want to elaborate on that for us a little bit as well, Don?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah, there is a little confusion on that. So the DART is a Bowie Dick test, right? That's just the marketing name for that type of Bowie Dick test, right? So the DART is from a specific manufacturer that took the liberty, because they also made sterilizers, to align the name of their Bowie Dick test with a cycle on the sterilizer. So they were, it made sense for them, right? You sell the sterilizer and you call it the DART cycle, and then you sell the test pack, the Bowie Dick test pack, with the same name on it. So, yeah, it's really a Bowie Dick test pack, just with a unique name.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah, and it's not unlike other manufacturers of Bowie Dick test packs. I've seen other ones out there, 3M Comply, Crosstech AirView. So think of it that way.
Right. So not a different product in general, just a different way of marketing it. And that DART test has a clue in it for when you run it. It stands for daily air removal test. That air removal test that you run daily. I think it's pretty clever. So, so you mentioned this is something that we need to be running daily. It's something that is primarily done on first shift just because you want that consistent time that's done every day to make sure that it's getting done. Walk us through some of the particulars about how the test is performed. I imagine people aren't still wrapping a stack of Huck towels with sterilizer tape.
Yeah, that is correct. Back in the day in the 60s when they developed this, that was just supplies that were readily available to them. I'm sure that's why they chose those. They just happened to be in the CS department already, so that's how they came about it. But it did, over the years, for many years, hospitals did use that. But of course, we've all moved away from that because it is very time consuming to build those test packs according to AMESC Site 9. So now there are commercially available test packs like the DART that have been proven to correlate to these towel packs. And I just want everyone to keep in mind that these that the Bowie Dick test pack itself is a chemical indicator, okay, guys? So it's really important to understand that. It's basically a chemical indicator test, okay? And once again, it is just assessing the function of the sterilizer to remove air from the chamber, okay? I don't know if I answered that question right, but...
So we open the chamber, just chunk the test in, right? And wherever it lands, it's good to go?
No, actually, there is some more science to that. So, okay. The way that the standards are written and the way that the Bowie Dick test packs are validated are in an otherwise empty chamber, okay? So when we say otherwise empty, people might be asked what that means. Otherwise empty means whatever chamber furniture comes with the sterilizer, okay? So that would probably be the rack or the cart, the loading cart. Other than that, your Bowie Dick test pack would go in there with no other load above the drain closest to the door, which is typically the worst case location in the sterilizer for steam penetration. So most IFUs for Bowie Dick test packs will pretty much parallel what's in ST79 and say the same thing. So when we think of Bowie Dick test packs, yes, you do have to put them in there. There is one other thing too with these Bowie Dick test packs. Something you'll see quite often with all the IFUs is that they do say there is a certain orientation how it lays on the shelf or the loading cart. It's usually face up and there's usually an arrow. Okay, that is important because that's the way it was validated. So pay particular attention to the IFU in regards to the orientation of the Bowie Dick test pack. You don't want it on its side unless it says to put it on its side or something like that. Now the DART, I believe, it's been a long time since I've seen one, but I do think they hang on a hanger that is provided with the DART. I don't know if they've changed that over the years, but read the instructions for use and follow manufacturer's instructions.
I knew that was going to come up at some point in this interview. And it may not be the last time. So that's helpful. All right. Yeah. So there is a particular process with the chamber. Let's talk about the cycle. Is it any old cycle that you run? You also alluded to that at least one of the manufacturers renamed the cycle to match their test. So what kind of cycle are we running for these tests?
Okay, that's really important as well. Most sterilizer companies that make a pre-vacuum sterilizer have a pre-programmed locked cycle called the Bowie Dick cycle on their sterilizer. So that's the cycle that you want to use. Now, you could get in a little trouble there too because some Bowie Dick test packs will have either 132 degrees C or 134 degrees C. Now, historically, when these tests started, it was 134 for 3.5 minutes. I don't know where the half minute ever came from. It's really odd because you don't really see half minute increments on any sterilization cycles, but the Bowie Dick has the 3.5. Now, most will now have a range on the IFUs, 132 to 134 for a minimum of 3.5 minutes and a maximum of 4 minutes. So you don't want to exceed 4 minutes. You'll see that everywhere. You'll see that in some of the standards. You'll see that in the IFUs, not to exceed 4 minutes, okay? So it sounds like, most of these cycles are going to be 132 or 134, and then either 3.5 minutes or 4. Now, you can't change those parameters on the sterilizer, guys. Those are locked parameters, and you just place your pack in there and run it. What I was getting at is you just want to be careful. Just, you might want to just check what the instructions for use for the Bowie Dick test pack you're buying with the cycle you're running it in.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great call out. Maybe a connected two-part question. You mentioned you don't want to exceed that 4 minutes. Now, obviously, if it's a preset configuration on your load, it sounds like you couldn't exceed it even if you wanted to, if you hit the right number. But why is that a problem? Like, what would happen to the test results if you went past 4 minutes? And then tying into the second part of that question, is there any downside to just leaving the test in the chamber after it's run for a long period of time? Is that going to do anything to my test?
That's another great question. All right, I'll answer the first one. So yeah, not to exceed the 4 minutes, that's important because at that temperature, 132 degrees Celsius, you are creating steam penetration, okay? So you don't want to exceed that because you want to capture what's happening between the 3.5 and 4 minutes, right? That's the time period where you're going to see if there's any residual air in the chamber. If you go longer, you will continue to penetrate the pack with that steam, and the indicator sheet that's in the pack will continue to change color, okay? So this chemical indicator ink, correlates with time, okay? So the longer it's exposed, the more it'll turn to its endpoint color. Typically, the Bowie Dick test packs, I believe a lot of them are to a black color, but there are lots of different other color schemes now, purple and green. I've seen all kinds of things. But at the end of the day, you interpret the result as a uniform color. So that sheet of ink that's in the Bowie Dick test pack has to be uniform from the outer edge to the inner edge. If you see a gradient of color, that could be an indication that you have a problem with your air removal system.
I'm glad that you brought up interpretation of the test, because that's a crucial part of this discussion as we're popping them open and taking a look at it. So what types of things can your Bowie Dick test tell you about your sterilizer as you're looking at that and seeing gradients or seeing a solid color? What kinds of things can you learn from looking at that test?
Yeah, so the biggest thing that usually comes to light when something like that happens is an air leak of some sort, okay? So it could be a number of different things within the sterilizer that could be causing that. It could be a valve has gone bad, or a seal, or just a leak in some of your piping. But that's typically what that would indicate, okay? There are other things. Non-condensable gases can also create or mimic air and give you a failed Bowie Dick test pack as well. So if your water quality is not all that hot, and we've talked about that in the past, I'm not going to get into water quality, but if you have non-condensable gases that are in the chamber, those could lead and mimic pockets of air as well. They could also throw your test off. But I think the number one leading cause would be some type of leak in your system.
Don, going back to that two-part question, and this is why I don't ask two-part questions, because it's always hard to get the second part. But I asked what happens, what's the downside, or is there a downside of leaving the test in there for a long period of time?
Yeah, so I personally don't think 5-10 minutes after the cycle's done, it's going to be detrimental, because at that point in time, you're back to ambient temperature. Well, I shouldn't say ambient temperature. I say you're at the mercy of whatever the jacket of the sterilizer is at that point. You're not at 132 degrees Celsius anymore, right? The chamber's back down to ambient pressure, I would say. Temperature could still be a little elevated, but now you're talking more of a dry heat, right? And that takes a lot longer to turn your indicator ink, right? So the indicator inks are designed to react to steam, and just sitting in a sterilizer with some dry heat, probably not going to drive that ink too much farther than it already has. But I wouldn't recommend leaving it in there for any long periods of time.
All right, so fast forwarding into the future, 5 more minutes. So that discussion about non-condensable gases and leaks is really interesting. It's fascinating to think about what goes on inside of that chamber with the pre-vacuum. That air can act like a cushion or a barrier that keeps your instruments from getting sterile, but that is pretty amazing that that's what actually takes place. So imagine that you've popped open your Bowie Dick test. You've got that gradient that indicates a leak. You've got air inside of the chamber somehow or some way. What should the technician do about that if they get a test out that indicates a failure?
Yeah, good question. And just one more thing I want to add to what could possibly cause it. We talked about non-condensable gases and leaks, but it also could be a problem with your vacuum, the way your vacuum is drawn, either an actual vacuum pump, which not a lot of sterilizers have, but there's also venturi valves that create the vacuums in the chamber. So it could be something to do with that too, the way the vacuum is drawn. Maybe you're not hitting your vacuum set point, right? So it could be the vacuum system as well, not just necessarily a leak. But getting back to what you do when that happens, well, you're going to have to go into investigation mode, guys. Most likely, unless you want to become your own sterilizer technician, most facilities probably have contracts with these sterilizers, and they're going to be calling in their technician, their sterilizer technician, or maybe their biomed department if they have their own internal people that do that. But yeah, there's going to have to be an investigation done. Maybe a verification test is always a good thing. Check all your cycle printouts. Double check everything. I mean, you could have loaded it wrong, you could have ran the wrong cycle. I would verify everything before you start calling a sterilizer technician just to make sure it wasn't an operator error. And then if you rule all that out, then of course move to that next level and see if you can get someone in there to take a look and see what's going on.
Yeah, that sterilizer technician, I think the Bowie Dick is his favorite cycle. If you came into work and you look back in the previous day and you've got a middle of the day Bowie Dick test, it's like, oh, our sterilizer guy was here messing around for sure.
Yeah. One other thing you can do before you call the sterilizer guy, just to throw that in there is one other thing you can do real quick, and it's really fast. You can do a leak test. Okay, that's another diagnostic test that's built in. If you run your leak test and the leak runs fine, that could also help the technician if he has to come in, right? The leak test passes fine. Maybe it isn't a leak. Maybe it is something else. You can at least rule that out.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And you mentioned that vacuum pump or that Venturi vacuum pump. That's a water-based system most of the time. And I didn't know this for the longest time about my sterilizers, but they actually do run on water. I assumed that because our steam came from a steam plant when we had a water outage, I thought the steam sterilizers would keep on going, but nope, sure enough, they quit because I guess they couldn't pull a vacuum without that water feed. So.
Yeah. And the Venturi valve is really dependent on your water pressure too. So if you lose water pressure in the building, your vacuum rate is going to be slower. I don't want to get it too technical here on you guys, but there's a lot of things that could be happening here.
Yeah. So, Don, there's a debate in the industry that has kind of been going back and forth. And I think I wasn't there, but I think it got a little heated at this past year's national conference. Some people had some strong opinions about this. So after a major repair or install of new equipment, what is the proper process or the ordering of the various tests that we need to run, including the Bowie Dick test? Like what place in that process, in that cadence, should these things be run?
Yeah, well, for the Bowie Dick test, when there's a major repair that occurs, according to AMI ST 79, they do require 3 consecutive passed Bowie Dick test packs. But I think you're also asking about the BI test packs too?
Yeah.
Yeah. The BI test packs, unless something's changed in SC79, as far as I remember, it was also 3 test packs.
And those happen like which order? Or does it matter?
Great.
How's the debate?
Great question, Hank. I personally would be doing the Bowie Dicks first and then going into the BI testing. Right? Because there's, the order of operations should be this. This is me personally here in our lab. I would like to know the vacuum system is working first before I start challenging a biological indicator. It's almost like this order of operations. Yeah, let's rule that out first, okay? Because number one, the Bowie Dick test packs are probably a little cheaper. If you want to go down that road, than the BI test packs. But I don't know if there's a really right or wrong way. I think as long as you have 3 and 3, you should be fine. But
I think that's why there was a debate, probably, because there's some nuanced gray area, and we hate that in sterile process. We live in it, but we hate it.
Yeah, no, I understand.
As we move to a wrap here, I want to ask around any myths or misconceptions that we haven't already brought up that you want to debunk or to bust right now. Is there anything that, like, when you hear people say it, you kind of scratch your head and you're like, oh my goodness, that's not quite true, or it's a little confusing? Is there anything that you just want to set the record straight?
Well, I think there may be confusion on what exactly the reason is for the Bowie Dick test. I think some of the confusion is it's assessing lethality of the sterilizer, and I guess it does sort of correlate to that. But I think, if anything, people need to understand this is just a chemical indicator test, assessing only one phase of your sterilizer. So if you look at the phases of the sterilization cycle, phase 1 is everything that happens before you get to exposure temperature. Phase 2 is the exposure temperature, whatever that is, the 4 minutes. And then phase 3 is your drying time and everything that happens after exposure. So this is really only assessing phase 1, everyone. So this is really important to understand that. It's not really, a lethality test per se. Okay, so I think that could be some of the myths behind this.
And I know that Hank's trying to wrap here, but you just sparked my curiosity. I'm just wondering, how in the world would a Bowie Dick test for air removal? Like, if I chucked one in my oven at 250 degrees at home for 10 minutes, would that turn one of these? Like, how are they checking for air removal, or is it more? Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay, here is the best way to do it. Ready for this? Next time you guys have access to a sterilizer, it hopefully will have a gravity option. Please put one of these Bowie Dick test packs in a gravity sterilizer, and you report back to me what that does.
Okay.
Guess what's going to happen, guys?
I'll take you up on that offer, and I'll report back, and we'll see what happens.
So that might lead to another misconception, is that you really do not want to use these for gravity sterilizers, right? Remember, a gravity sterilizer does not have a pre-vacuum, or a gravity cycle, I should say, does not have a pre-vacuum phase, okay? So there is no need for the Bowie Dick test pack, right? Because there's nothing to assess with it. It was meant for the air removal phase of the sterilizer, and gravity cycles do not have that. Now, another misconception is that people buy pre-vacuum sterilizers, but they also have a gravity option. So just because there's a gravity cycle on a pre-vacuum sterilizer doesn't mean you don't have to do the Bowie Dick test pack.
That kind of goes back to the history that we mentioned at the beginning, because the invention of these packs came up around the invention of this new sterilization method, right? The pre-vacuum. And so we needed a new way of testing it. So yeah, thanks for tying that back into the history. As we wrap and think forward into the future, any ideas on where Bowie Dick testing might go, or air removal might go in the future?
Wow, yeah, that's an excellent question. It already has moved into the future, just not technically here in the U.S. How's that? It has moved ahead in Europe. If you go to Europe, you know how they are. They're big and environmentally conscious, waste. If you head over there, you're going to see electronic Bowie Dick test packs. I don't know if you guys are familiar with those or heard of those, but it's basically time and temperature, okay? And so there's little temperature sensors in these, and they basically assess the temperature within this electronic Bowie Dick test pack. So it's a little box, and then there's a number of temperature sensors, and it gives you it collects data over the cycle and tells you if the conditions were met. So it's a correlation, or some people might want to say a sort of parametric release way of doing the Bowie Dick test. Like I said, it's an electronic Bowie Dick test pack, and they're available now. There's a number of companies that have them.
Yeah, that's it is fun to look overseas sometimes and know that's coming for us. We don't know when, but we know it's probably going to be hitting our shores, one of these years. And yeah, that's one of those things I saw at the World Congress back in 2019 for the first time. I was like, oh, that's curious, and that makes a lot of sense. So it's still 2023, and we ain't seen it yet.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a hard selling here in the U.S. because there's so many manufacturers. This is it's a consumable, and it's a good moneymaker, and it might be a little difficult to sell that here in the U.S.
Yeah. Well, on the history and the future note, Don, I think that's a great place to wrap for this interview. But I got a guess that there may still be some questions for folks who tune in on topics that we didn't get a chance to cover for these tests. What's the best way for folks to track you down if they have another question or follow-up for you?
Okay, great. Yeah, you can Google me, or you can send an email to Tumminelli at vtls.com. It's a long one.
Okay. And are you on LinkedIn at all?
I am, yeah. You can find me on LinkedIn, sure.
Okay, yeah, track him down on LinkedIn as well. Okay.
Or if you're down at the AME meetings in a couple weeks, I'll be there.
Yeah, and there's a growing number of sterile processing users that are starting to go to those meetings more and more each year. So hopefully you see the presence. And yeah, hopefully you have some folks that come up and say, hey, I heard you on Beyond Clean. Actually, I don't know if this episode is going to go out before those AME meetings, so maybe
right. No worries,
on the back end. But yeah.
No worries.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, Don, thanks so much for coming back on the show today.
Have a good day.
And that was Don Tumminelli, Senior Technical Manager of Client Services at High Power Validation Testing and Lab Services. Bobby, fun conversation with Don. I've liked him from the moment I met him, and I can't say that about a lot of people.
Yeah, this is a good one for this season. Probably going to be my favorite, although, you can't pick your favorite kids. I guess you can pick your favorite podcast episodes. But yeah, really interesting trying to dig into the details of it. And I feel like there's some questions still unanswered about how do these things test for air removal? It's pretty, it still blows my mind.
That's right. Yeah. He laid out a challenge, kind of, the old fashioned way. Don't ask me how. Won't you show me how? So he said, go do these tests in gravity and then come back and tell me what you see, which I like. That's an interesting teaching method too. But yeah, what I love, and I kind of mentioned this at the beginning of the intro, one of the visions for Beyond Clean early on was getting access to these kinds of folks in our industry, because the average technician and manager just will never come across Don on the street or at a conference, right? Like you wouldn't necessarily know him just walking down the street. This guy knows so much about these Bowie Dick tests, but to get him on a platform like this, to be able to pick his brain and ask him these practical questions that we've always either assumed we knew, or we knew that we didn't know, and we didn't know where to go to get the answer. Really, really cool thing to be a part of. So that's going to do it for this episode. I want to thank you for tuning in to this season all about consumables, and remind you, like we do each week here at Beyond Clean, to keep fighting dirty.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on your favorite podcast app, or by downloading the smartphone app on iPhone or Android. Simply search for Beyond Clean in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@beyondclean.net. We look forward to hearing from you.